Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, where we take an in-depth look at how news around the world is impacting Taiwan. I'm Jeremy Olivier. It's been several years since China began arresting hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in its far western Xinjiang region. Mosques were torn down and children separated from families. Since then, despite international pressure, China has not backed down. It says it's preventing terrorism and developing Xinjiang's economy. Beijing has tightened its grip on the region, building up a system of surveillance and forced labor that has global implications, including for Taiwan, which China claims as its own. To learn more about this topic, I'm joined by Darren Byler, a professor of anthropology at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, and an expert on Xinjiang. For more than a decade, he's been researching and writing on the changes happening in the region. Darren, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be with you.
So let's just start off with the situation on the ground. Can you give us a brief rundown of what's been happening in Xinjiang, and have there been any recent changes or updates there?
Well, in some ways, the system in Xinjiang has normalized. In 2019, the governor of the region said that the camps were being closed, everyone was graduating. But what we know from evidence that we see on the ground is that those that have been detained, which is hundreds of thousands of people, are still missing. They are either being pushed into prison, or they're still in some kind of detention, or they've been sent to work in factories. But the system is normalized in the sense that they're not detaining new people and that they're actively trying to hide what they've done. It means that there's a danger that what's happened could be forgotten, that it, even as it's ongoing, that the world will start to turn away.
In your writing on China's Xinjiang policies, you've noted that the situation there now is an outgrowth of a settler colonialist project by the Chinese government. How so?
Well, the story of Xinjiang really starts in the 1990s, or at least the story of what's happened recently. In the 90s, China was opening up to the West, becoming a manufacturer for the world and needing raw materials to drive the economy. The Uyghur region, which is this immense space in northwest China, it's one-sixth of China's landmass, is the source of 20% of China's oil and natural gas, and even higher percentage of China's coal, and has become the source of essential products for the economy, such as cotton and tomatoes. And so Xinjiang has become a resource colony for the Chinese economy. And as that's happened, many people from other parts of the country have moved into Uyghur majority areas. These are mostly Han people, and they've begun a process of sort of taking over, capturing the Uyghur-run institutions like the banking system, the school system, and so on. And so that has produced an experience of dispossession among Uyghurs, which has led to protest and at times to violence. And that is why the state is saying that we now need to use camps to control these people and actually fully remove them, or largely remove them, from their villages and from the land, to make it accessible to the settler population.
You've compared the situation in Xinjiang to, among others, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Now, Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas was just recently in China, where he praised the Chinese government's approach to Xinjiang, saying that it was aimed at stamping out extremism and opposing terrorism and separatism. Is there any truth to those comments, and what's behind this lack of solidarity?
Well, I think Mahmoud Abbas is thinking as a diplomat. He's thinking about trade and support for Palestinian causes, and he thinks he can get those from China. I think he doesn't understand at all what's going on the ground in northwest China. He may have visited, I'm not even sure. But if he did go to visit, and other journalists and diplomats have, those people are given a guided tour of spaces that the state wants those visitors to see. They're introduced to people who have been coached in what they should say. So they haven't seen, based on those visits, any sort of reality of what's actually happening there. And I think many of them understand that that's probably true. But China gives a narrative that allows people to turn away, and especially state leaders who are mostly concerned about their domestic population, about economic growth. it's not the same as them saying they would want China to do the same thing to their populations or to them. They're saying, we'll look the other way as long as you continue to do trade with us.
I also want to look at the bigger picture here. So you've argued that the core issue in Xinjiang is not necessarily just authoritarian Chinese state power, but a system of global capitalism that you've dubbed terror capitalism. Now, can you explain this concept?
Sure. So terror capitalism is my attempt to understand what the figure of the terrorist, what it does when it's attached to an entire population of people, saying that they're inherently evil, they're inherently bad, that is outside of the normal rule of law. And so civil rights as pertain to Han citizens in China are not granted to Uyghurs, for instance. And so this is a kind of racialized capitalism, really, then, where, because these people are deemed different, their land can be taken from them, their bodies can be taken from them, they can be sent to work in factories, and there's no, repercussion for that action. But I was also, as I was thinking about terror capitalism, I was thinking about how it's related to new kinds of surveillance, which have to do with the ways in which biometrics are taken from people, which is, face scans, DNA, fingerprints, all of those sorts of things. And so the tech companies in China really saw Xinjiang as an opportunity to develop new tools, which could then be adapted for other purposes. And so terror capitalism also speaks to this dynamic. It's racialized surveillance capitalism that is being sort of experimented on, pioneered in some ways in Northwest China, and then can be used in other domains. And so we now see some of the systems in Xinjiang being exported elsewhere.
And so within this racialized surveillance capitalist system that you're describing, you've noted that both public and private businesses in China and elsewhere are benefiting. So what kinds of companies are involved here, and what's the extent of their involvement?
Sure. So most of the system in Xinjiang when it comes to surveillance was built by private companies who contracted with the state. And they received these big contracts to build these systems. They also received access to state data, which is, public security data, which is what a computer vision company needs to drive, to build algorithmic tools, which are automated machine learning tools. The entire system is really designed and built by private companies. They're actually produced the terrorist, which is this Uyghur population, by defining who is the terrorist and building all of these ways of detecting their past behavior and predicting future behavior. There's other companies as well, which are manufacturers, particularly in the textile industry, who've benefited quite a lot from their access to cheap labor and to cheap cotton. So it's really, it's at a frontier space of the global economy.
Just to give everyone an idea of how truly global this issue is, Xinjiang produces 20% of the world's cotton, but mounting evidence suggests Uyghurs are being forced to pick it. That's created a challenge for fast fashion retailers like H&M and Zara, who've been accused of using Xinjiang cotton to make some of their products. Some of them have sworn against it. Recently, though, a wave of lawsuits has been filed in Europe. Two of the most recent ones target major clothing companies and car manufacturers. These suits allege these firms have continued to rely on Uyghur forced labor for their products. It's part of a growing push by activists and advocacy groups to hold to account corporations they say are turning a blind eye to abuses in Xinjiang. In May, human rights protesters disrupted German carmaker Volkswagen's annual shareholders meeting over the company's plant in Xinjiang. The US has banned imports of products from Xinjiang, but the EU has not made a similar move. So Darren, what do you make of these lawsuits that are being filed in Europe? Is this an indication that the world is starting to turn away from the concept of terror capitalism?
In many ways, fast fashion brands have already begun to relocate their supply chains, or at least they say they are. So companies like H&M have said that they're relocating to other suppliers, but it's sort of moving in bits and pieces. Some companies are still continuing to source materials in Xinjiang and not really facing any sort of repercussions. What I found in talking to companies and to lawmakers and others about these issues is that unless companies are sort of forced to change their suppliers. They really won't. Most companies have an ethics statement, an ethics board. They talk about fair trade and things like that. But when it comes down to it, it's mostly about profit and whether or not they'll be held accountable for the profits that they're making. And so it's up to lawmakers, it's up to the public, it's up to journalists to hold them accountable.
So I'd like to bring us back to Taiwan now. So during the Hong Kong protests in 2019, one of the phrases demonstrators often repeated was, yesterday Xinjiang and Tibet, today Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan. Should Taiwan be concerned about the kind of high-tech surveillance that's being used against Muslim minorities in Xinjiang?
Well, I think all of us should be concerned, both in Taiwan and everywhere else in the world, about this kind of technology, because it's technology that's actually in many ways available already in most places in the world. It's mostly now used in international borders, where you have your face scanned. Mostly it's companies like Facebook or Twitter that's tracking your movement, selling that to advertisers. And so it feels like it's convenient and it's benign, but actually it is pervasive. The primary difference is that in China has complete sovereignty over space and can decide how these tools are used. It can withdraw or withhold protections for civil rights. And so as an autocratic state moves and begins to exert that kind of sovereignty over another space, like we see now in Hong Kong, those tools now have a different kind of potential to control human behavior, social expression, and so on. There is some important differences still, though, because in Hong Kong, the Chinese state doesn't own the rails when it comes to how people connect. So a lot of people are using Telegram and other encrypted apps that the Chinese state can't fully control. But I think the Chinese state and the Russian state and other states that are doing similar kinds of projects are looking for tools that will begin to roll out these things at scale, even if they don't own the rails, as I was just saying. So it feels as though those are kind of a creeping digital authoritarianism that is moving into different spaces. And so it's dangerous because our lives are all online now. Our digital histories are everywhere. And states, if they have access to that material, can use that against you.
So given what you're saying, how can Taiwan prevent the encroachment of this kind of system within its borders? How can it strive to be not complicit in the atrocities taking part in Xinjiang?
Well, I think there's some space in Taiwan, especially when it comes to the supply chain issues of things related to fast fashion, for instance, where Taiwan could do quite a bit more to prevent products being made with forced labor from being entering the Taiwan economy. I was just in Taiwan and I saw that there's a Muji store there, which is a Japanese brand that is sort of championed its use of Xinjiang cotton as part of its branding campaign. And I'm in Canada and we have a Muji down the street here too, and it's also still selling its products. So it's not as though Taiwan is uniquely complicit. It's complicit in the way that many other states are. But I think there could be, regulation with teeth that comes from the state saying that, we're not going to allow this into our economy. And I know that there is already some concerns around Chinese technology, especially those that are complicit in working with the state in Taiwan, and those things could be further enforced. I think there is already, some of that is already in motion in Taiwan.
Darren, that was a really insightful conversation on a very important topic. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I was really happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.